I don't know if you remember 2 years ago, the plane crash, Asiana Flight 214 coming from Seoul, Korea, July 6, 2013, crashed on the runway at San Francisco Airport. Do you remember that scene? The images were all pumping in through our TV screens of this plane out on the runway with the tail ripped off of it, on fire, people fleeing for their lives, running in all directions from the plane. One of the things that hit me the hardest as I was looking at those images was how many people were running from this burning plane carrying their luggage. I don't know if you remember that, if you even noticed that, but it just got me thinking, like all these people, this plane has crashed, it's on fire, it's about to explode any minute as far as they all know, but somehow in all of that, so many of them got up, opened up the overhead bins, kind of puts a whole new twist on that warning they always give you. Please be careful as you open the overhead bins because your luggage may have shifted during the flight. Pull them down, slide down those slides, those inflatable slides with their luggage, pull up the handle, and then running for their lives from a burning plane with their luggage behind them. One man was interviewed by the New York Times, and he actually admitted that he got his luggage down first and then grabbed his child, in that order. And I don't want to be too critical of these people. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if half of the ones who grabbed their luggage just did it unconsciously, right? Just as a matter of rote in a daze. And I also don't want to criticize because we all cling to things, don't we? You know, it's interesting in the Bible, almost every time a new character is introduced, I don't know if you've noticed this before, but they're almost always holding on to something. Almost always carrying something that they're betting their life on, right? For Joseph, it was his Technicolor dream coat, remember? For David, it was his slingshot. For the disciples, it was their nets. For Zacchaeus, it was that tree. For the man with the merchant, it was that rare pearl of rare price. We have the man with the grain, the farmer with the grain, it was his barns. Do you remember? The widow, it was her 2 coins. For the little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he was holding it. It seems like every time someone comes face to face with God, they're holding on to something, they're clinging to something that they're scared or reluctant to let go of, right? Do you remember what it was for Moses? Do you remember what he was holding? You remember the story of Moses, how he had been found in those reeds and raised in Pharaoh's court, very affluent childhood, but then it all kind of goes south when he ends up murdering one of the Egyptians who's attacking a Hebrew slave. And so he has to run for his life, and he leaves Egypt, and he goes out into the wilderness, and he's tending his father-in-law Jethro's sheep as a living. He's become a shepherd, and he's sort of out in hiding, out in the middle of the wilderness. And then one day, he's out shepherding his sheep. It's what he does. It's who he is at this point. And suddenly, he hears his name. He sees a bush that's being burned. And that wouldn't be that unusual because there in that desert, hot desert climate, it wasn't completely unrealistic for a bush to just spontaneously combust into fire. But this bush was different because it was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. Do you remember that? And he walks over and he hears God call his name. I mean, can you imagine? Jody, John, Nicole, Joe, you're standing on holy ground. So he takes off his shoes and he has this deeply spiritual encounter with God in that place. And he hears God telling him that he's supposed to go back to Egypt and to free God's people, to carry them out of Egypt and into the promised land. And it's interesting. Do you remember the way he reacts? I mean, he's very much like us, isn't he? He has 1,001 excuses why he couldn't possibly be the right guy for this project, this plan of God's. He talks about his stuttering, and he talks about his inexperience. He says, who am I? I'm nothing but a lowly shepherd. How is anyone even going to believe me? They're going to laugh at me when they see me. And do you remember how God reacts? Let me read this to you from the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus. Then Moses answered God, "But suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' And I, the Lord," this is God, "said to him, 'Moses, what is that in your hand?' And Moses said, 'A staff.' And God said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So Moses threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake. And Moses drew back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Reach out your hand and seize it by the tail.' So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand." Interesting, isn't it? An odd little story about this staff. And yet, it really is so much more than just a staff, isn't it? The things that we cling to, the things that we hold on to, have a way of becoming symbols for us, kind of defining our character, don't they? The things that we cling to, the things we hold on to, end up shaping us. Now, for a shepherd, a staff was really all they needed. It was kind of their whole identity. It said who they were. It's what they needed to do what they did. If sheep were being stubborn and kind of rambunctious, they could poke it or prod it or push it with their staff. If a sheep was going in the wrong direction, they could pull them back to the group with the staff. If one was about to fall off a cliff, they could rescue it with their staff. If a predator was coming to attack a sheep, they could defend it. If a robber came to attack the shepherd, they could defend themselves. I kind of had this picture when I was reading. I was starting to laugh about, do you remember David Cain as Kung Fu and the things he was able to do with his staff? Or for those of you of a different generation, Kung Fu Panda. Have you ever seen him with his staff, what he's able to do? It's amazing. A staff is all that the shepherd needs, right? Remember Psalm 23? Says, "You are my shepherd, thy staff and thy rod, they comfort me." This is who Moses had become. This was his identity. It was the thing that he was holding on to. In fact, it was the thing that was keeping him from being able to trust that God could use him the way that God was planning to use him. And so the scholars have debated all these years about what is going on with this crazy story and a snake and seizing it by the tail, but I think it's really simple. I think that staff was the thing that Moses treasured, the thing that he clung to, the thing he was trusting and betting his life on. And what God was saying is, give that thing over to me. Lay that thing that you're holding on to so tightly at my feet, and then just see what I'll be able to do with you. It's a good question, isn't it? It's one of those questions that's so much deeper than what it appears to be on the surface. What is that in your hand? What is that in your hand? What is it that you cling to? What is it that you treasure and hold on to so tightly that there isn't room to pick up anything else? For some of us, it's our money, right? For others, it's our career or our academic degrees or our reputation. For many of us, it's our families, isn't it? For some, it's our dreams and our hopes and our goals, while for others, it's actually the loss of our dreams and hopes and goals. It's crazy how many people hold so tightly onto the losses and the disappointments and the failures and the rejections and the hurts in their life. Their whole identity gets wrapped up into how tightly they cling to this identity of being a victim. Doesn't that happen easily? The things that we hold on to, the things that we cling to, they shape us. They cause us to become who we are. You know, I think Jesus was saying the exact same thing when he was doing this series of life lessons, these sermons that they called the Sermon on the Mount. And do you remember what he said? Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves instead treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. And then he says this, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now look, it's a normal thing for us to treasure things. That's what it is to be a human being, isn't it? To cherish things, to protect things, to value things and love things above other things and want to cling on to them and hold them tightly and close. You know, some of us aren't even aware of what we treasure. I don't know, you probably have answered that question before. We've all answered the one, if you woke up in the middle of the night and your house was on fire and you only had a few moments to grab a few things, what would you grab? After your children. I feel like I should throw that in after that opening illustration. Well, for me, it's always been my photographs and my journals. I feel like they're the only thing that I could never replace if I were to lose. Other people say if you want to know what it is that you actually treasure, not just what you think you treasure, but what you actually treasure, go ahead and open your checkbook sometime and read through the registry, because it will read like the definitive response to all the things you treasure in your life. Other people say you can do the same thing by opening your calendar, by looking at your calendar day to day the last few years if you really want to know what you actually treasure. But Jesus says, make no bones about this. Let's not fool ourselves. The things that we treasure, they actually shape us. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? The things that we hold closely, the things that we cling to, the things that we treasure, they actually start to not just be a symbol, but we become more like those things that we treasure. Isn't it true? And so if you treasure money, your life is going to be shaped by greed and competition. And if you treasure security, your life is going to begin to be shaped by fear and a sense of vulnerability. If you treasure power, your life will start to be formed by arrogance and control. If you treasure physical appearance, your life will begin to be shaped by vanity and by comparison. And if you treasure people's opinions, then your life will be shaped by what others think about you. Isn't it true? We all know that we are... Is everyone okay? Oh, gosh, I thought it was a person. I'm all better now. We are shaped by the things that we cling tightly to and that we treasure. And so I think the thing that Jesus is trying to say in this passage is he's saying, you know, it really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to treasure these things that we build and accumulate here on earth. Right? It just doesn't make a lot of strategic sense. We claim to be great business people, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to accumulate treasures here on earth. I want you to imagine for a minute, a few years ago, way before I was here, we had talked to the American church in Paris about going over and doing a little stint. They do these 3-year stints for pastors to come over from the U.S. And I was thinking about that, and imagine that you got given this opportunity to go over to Paris for 1 year. It's like sort of the dream job that you could have ever have. They're going to pay to fly you over there, put you up in a hotel, and fly you back. Going to pay you twice as much as you've ever made doing anything for a year. But the only catch is this. Although you can wire as much money as you want, the whole year you're making this money, you can wire as much of it as you want back to the bank in L.A. At the end of the year, when it's time to go home, you can't take anything that you have there in Paris with you. None of the money, it all has to be left behind at the airport. None of the things that you've collected along the way in Paris, you have to leave it there in Paris. So how many of you, if you had that kind of a deal, would spend most of your time and most of your energy and most of your money buying beautiful decorative wall hangings for your hotel room? Or fancy pieces of art to decorate it as lavishly as you could for the year that you were there? I mean, nobody would do that. It just doesn't make good strategic sense, does it? Well, our stint here on earth is a temporary assignment, friends. doesn't make sense. Everything that we accumulate here on earth is going to either leave us or else we're going to leave it. It's just as simple as that, isn't it? So the question is, are we storing up for ourselves treasures here on earth or treasures in heaven? So how do we do that? How do we accumulate treasures in heaven? How do we leave a legacy? How do we do things that are going to live on, that we actually can take with us, that will be there on the other side of the river when we pass from this life to the next life? What does that look like? Well, for some people, it's as simple as learning some new priorities in life. Reprioritizing some things, learning to treasure some new things that maybe we haven't given a lot of time to before. I love it every time I see someone new go down on one of those Mexico trips. I know, my heart leaps for joy because I know that they're starting to treasure something new. They're making room in their life to have a new priority that really might change their life, that might help them to really find the true, deep down soul satisfaction that we're all looking for. Every time someone brings in some peas or corn or pies for this Thanksgiving basket, I know they were in the grocery store doing that regular shopping they usually do, and they said, oh, wait a second, let me go over here and get some cans for those Thanksgiving baskets. Every time someone joins the choir or starts a new ministry, Mike came on to personnel recently, I feel like it's making room in our lives for some new priorities, and I love that. But maybe the best way that we can store up treasures in heaven is to simply loosen our grip a little bit on the things that we already treasure, on the things that we're already clinging to and holding so closely, putting those treasures that we find dear into God's hands so that God can do something spectacular and new and life-giving with those things. I mean, this is exactly what was going on in this story about Moses, wasn't it? I mean, this staff was the symbol of his identity, of his new life as a shepherd, away from Egypt, off, sequestered by himself in this small little life. And when he asked, how would anyone take me, a shepherd, seriously? I mean, look at me, staff, gown, sheep around me, muck on my feet. How could anyone not laugh at me? And God says, let go of that staff. You give me that staff, and I'm going to use that staff as the very thing that's going to convince anybody who asks that I am the one who has sent you. That staff was the symbol of his being isolated out there in the wilderness in this small little world by himself, and yet it's the staff itself that's going to be raised in front of the Red Sea and part the Red Sea so that the Israelites can escape to the Promised Land. It's the same thing throughout the Scriptures. God says, give me those nets to the disciples, and I will make you fishers of men. Put those 5 loaves and those 2 fish into my hands, and we will create a miracle that the world will be talking about for the rest of eternity. The reality is, when we take those treasures that we cling so tightly to, and we loosen our grip, and we turn them over into God's hands, extraordinary miracles happen all the time, over and over again. Do you remember the movie Schindler's List? True story about Oskar Schindler. The thing that he was clinging to, that he held so tightly to, was his whole identity as a wealthy, materialistic businessman, right? He was a very wealthy man in the Nazi bureaucratic machine until something inside told him it was time to loosen his grip. It was time to turn his identity, his gift, his treasure over to God. And for the next however many years, he spent the rest of his life going around using his money to try to buy slave labor from all of the different places around Krakow and Poland, and trying to get more and more people, buy more and more people under the guise of needing them as slave labor so that he could actually secretly set them free. He literally went to the ovens at Auschwitz and grabbed little children who were about to be thrown in the ovens out of the ovens and said, don't you understand? I need these children. I need them to work for us. else's hands are small enough to go inside of the casing of this 45 millimeter shell? Will your hands fit inside of it? No, I need these children. And he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy them so that he could set them free. And at the end of the movie, I don't know if you remember, he saved over 1,100 people throughout the course of these years that he was doing this. And at the end of the movie, there's this giant celebration for him, and they're all celebrating him, and he is having none of it. He breaks down and cries and says, "You don't understand. You don't understand." And he turns to his limousine. He says, "My limousine, if I had sold it, I could have bought 10 more people. 10 more people's lives could have been saved just for that car." He pulls his fountain pen out of his pocket and he says, "This fountain pen, 2 more people, that could have been at least 1 more person could have lived because I could have sold this pen, but I didn't." The true sign of our success isn't how much we have, but what we do with what we have, right? Next week is Recommitment Sunday here at the church. And we're all asking every one of you to come to church with our pledge card filled out, ready to give and make a commitment. It can be changed at any time if circumstances change, but make our best guess at the way we want to bind our lives and our treasures to the ongoing life-giving ministries of this church this year. And I believe that the very best thing that I could do for this stewardship campaign, it's been a great stewardship campaign. Thank you. Stephen and the whole team have done an amazing job. Lindsay Cousley has an unbelievable insert. If you haven't read it inside your bulletin, make sure you read it. It's one of the best I've ever read. But for all the things that we've been doing these last couple of weeks, there is nothing that will do more for the success of this stewardship campaign than if I can convince you to simply go home and spend some time in prayer, asking God what God thinks you can and should do for the church this year. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, because I know that if this is something that you and God work out together between yourselves, then I know it's going to be the perfect amount for the church. That God is calling us to do exactly the amount of ministry that will happen if you give the amount that God is nudging you to give. And I also know it will be the right number because I know that God knows your situation, knows your obligations, knows your needs, knows all of the things about your life. And if God leads you to a certain number to write on that pledge card, then I am also confident that God will take care of you and bless you and give you a wonderful, fulfilling, satisfied life with whatever is left over. Right? Because nobody else can possibly ever convince us to loosen our grip on the things that we treasure and cling to and hold close. But we also all know that some of the greatest joys and the greatest satisfaction in life comes when God convinces us to loosen up that grip and to put the things that we hold dearest into God's hands. And then God performs miracles with those things. We all know that God loves us. We all know that God has given us every blessing and every gift that we enjoy in this life. And we all know that the greatest satisfaction in our life comes when we turn our treasures over to God's hands and then see what God can do with them. So let's spend this week thinking and, more importantly, praying about how God would use our treasures, the things that we cling to, the things that we hold dearly, to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, to build an eternal legacy. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Amen.